their faces. In Carmen, Janice, Lynn, Maureen, Liz, Joyce, Anne, and Jose Mario. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, wherever you are. Again, lovely to see everybody. So many smiling faces, familiar faces. So a hearty welcome to everyone. Today, again, we're going to have an interesting session, but I'll just allow Father John Paul to introduce us on that session today. So enjoy. Over to you, Father John Paul.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. And again, on behalf of Tantra Ecumenical Institute and the Ignatian Spirituality Committee in Geneva, we welcome you to this fifth in a series of 6 reflections on the way to Pentecost. Today, we're going to be focusing on the return to the Lake of Galilee. Jesus telling his disciples in Matthew and Mark's account, go back to Galilee, and there you will experience me as resurrected. And so leading us in our tour today, I will let Frederick Masson introduce our tour guide.
Hello and welcome to everyone. So today we are blessed to have again Nizar Haloun, a Christian Palestinian Israeli citizen, photojournalist, licensed tour guide. And while devoted to Jerusalem, his roots are in Galilee, specializing in the Byzantine and Crusader periods in the Holy Land. And he has a soft spot for Christian denominations, liturgies, and world religions. So today he is bringing us to the north, where he is from. He's originally from the north, to help us to discover the beautiful area of the Lake of Tiberias. Nizar, all to you.
Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Father Jean-Paul and Frederick. So nice to see all of you again this week. We have a long journey ahead of us, so just jump right into it. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So this is the introduction. We're going to have the resurrection experience at the Sea of Galilee today, as Father Jean-Paul and Petra mentioned. But we're not only. So the resurrection, and we're going to see also other spots that we mentioned last week, but not all of them. So we have new spots that we're going to see with many pictures and video as well. Okay, so let's start with our first slide, which is a much more cultural slide, right? So we're talking about Galilee, and just to talk about how beautiful this area is, there's a very famous poet called Tamim Barghouti that has a small verse in his one of his poems about Galilee that says a lot actually about the area. So the verse in English translates to, "He who simply says, 'My house is in Galilee,' says a poem without, though he is not a poet." So it says so much about the area and how beautiful this area is. So I worked with this calligraphy last couple of years ago for a book cover that I collaborated on. And it was made by a Jerusalemite calligrapher called Talal Siam that lives in Jerusalem. So let's have an overview of the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Tiberias. So the numbers, we have them here, the max length, the max width. You can have a look at them in the kilometers and in the miles as well. The surface area, the max depth, right? And which is interesting as well to know is that it's the lowest freshwater lake on Earth and the second lowest lake in the world after the very famous Dead Sea. You probably saw many pictures on the internet, or if you've been there as well, with the people like, you know, floating on the lake as well, right? And we have the many names of the Sea of Galilee. These are only some of them. So the Sea of Galilee that we know, Sea of Tiberias, Lake of Tiberias, Sea of Kinneret that is mentioned in the Old Testament, and the Lake of Gennesareth as well. So here we have a topographical map and laid by another map on the left hand side. You can see how dynamic topographically and geologically speaking the area is. And you can speak a lot about the geology of the area as well from the rock point of view and how the lake, the two lakes actually, the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea were formed with the tectonic plates moving northward. And so it's also a whole domain that you can talk about. And the Sea of Galilee is one of the highlight places where you can talk about those as well. So the important sites around the lake that we're going to visit today, that, like mentioned in the description, we have 5 sites. We have Magdala, so we'll start in the northwestern shore of the sea. Then we will visit Tabga, right, with the Church of the Multiplication. Then the Primacy of Peter, where we'll visit the first site. I mean, actually, the site of the post-resurrection, right, in the area of Tiberias. Then Capernaum, it's a very important site that will take our time to visit. It's a very important site in the New Testament. And we have also lots of archaeological remains that we're gonna really dig into. And the last site that we mentioned also last week, Mount of Beatitudes, with the Church of the Beatitudes that we are going to close our session today with. Okay. So Magdala, it's many know the site of Magdala or the name of Magdala from the name Magdala, right, from the New Testament, with being the birthplace of Mary of Magdalene, and it's most importantly the home of one of the oldest synagogues in the world, discovered quite recently, not that recently, but still. And it's a very important archaeological site that many pilgrims visit while they are in the area of Tiberias. So this is an aerial view of the site of Magdala, right? You see the 2 arrows pointing, one of them pointing in this area for the rock, and this is the zoomed in view of the rock. All 4 Gospels refer to Mary Magdalene and the town of Magdala in different shape or form, but this is one of the solid options for the site of Magdala, and it's one of the only synagogues from the Second Temple period. And when we are talking about the Second Temple period, right, we're talking from the time that the Jews came back to build the Second Temple in 560 BC to 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And this synagogue, this site, is placed between the 50 BC and 100 AD. So we are clearly in the Second Temple period, right? And the most important in this site is the Magdala stone that was discovered during the excavations, which is the table on which they read the Torah, right, the Old Testament. And the highlight of this rock is the menorah in the center that we can see the yellow square around it with the 7 branches candelabrum before the destruction of the second temple. So we have a small depiction of the candelabrum, and there's a whole also analysis around the function and the role of the synagogue during the first and the second temple period, because during those periods the synagogues did not function of the function that they have today, actually, which they call in Hebrew the Mikdash Katan, the small temple, where people go today and pray. It wasn't as organized as we have it today. It's only after the destruction of the second temple that this whole ritual of going on specific days and following a specific reading schedule and having specific traditions of prayers were set only after the destruction of the second temple to conserve the memory of the temple and the functions that were taking place in the temple. So that's why they call the synagogues Mikdash Katan, the small temple. So in the same site as well, at the end of the site, actually, when you enter, visit the whole archaeological area, you have a small church, a small chapel that was built to accommodate pilgrims for prayers. You have even weddings that take place here. I attended a wedding here a couple of years ago, which is also beautiful. And you have the 12 apostles with the icons that are covered in this picture. In a Byzantine style, as you can see on both sides, you have Mary and Christ. And most noteworthy is the altar here, which is a boat, and you have the tabernacle on it, and behind it you can see the Sea of Galilee and the Golan Heights behind it. So it's quite impressive, quite a unique chapel to see when you are in the area. So this is for Magdala. We're moving on to our second spot, which is Tabga, right? Heptapegon, which means the 7 springs, or the church of the 7 of the multiplication. So this site belongs to the German Benedictines that own and manage the place. The structure itself dates to different periods, most of all to the 4th and 5th century, and later on during the 20th century, there will be excavations here, and they will discover the beautiful mosaics that we're going to see closer up later on, and they will be restored and some of them completed, and they will opt for a much more sober style in the architecture, as you can see with the general view that we see here, right? So it's Byzantine, it's supposed to be a very charged church, but they opted for a much more a calmer structure, just to emphasize the mosaics all around and the beauty of the location, right? So when you walk in, you can see those beautiful shapes on the floor. You can see the 2 icons in the Byzantine style on the 2 aisles on both sides. You have also mosaics that will go into a bit later into much more details. Okay, and on the windows you can see a very special stone that we talked about last week when we talked about the church of the Transfiguration that are very transparent, first of all, and they let in the light again. So you have this kind of transparency with the outside again in this church as well. So the Church of the Multiplication, that follows the tradition that we read in Matthew 14:13 to 21. So we're going to read the passage and see how it relates to the place and why this place is so important. Okay, so Jesus feeds the 5,000. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by a boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowd followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed 2 people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So what's very interesting here is like, even before starting our passage, right, we have a sentence that is very interesting, right? Because we are talking, when Jesus heard about what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. So it's very curious when we start reading, we see, I mean, why are they including this sentence that connects to the following miracle that we see? So it's interesting, something interesting to go back to the previous chapter and see what's going on and how this links to the miracle itself of feeding of the 5,000. Okay. So the ground plan of the church that we already mentioned. So we have the phases from the 4th and the 5th century, and later on from the 12th century that we saw already general view from the first picture, right? So we have the tiny church here from the 4th century, and later on the 5th century you will have a much larger construction with an atrium, right? Before you enter the church, you have the atrium that leads into the church, and then they have the mosaics that were discovered later on in the 20th century and how they were conserved. So when we had a look on general view from the first picture, we had it from this area more or less, and we saw that the area of the altar and some of the sides as well. So if we do a small zoom to the left-hand side, when you enter, you have this beautiful mosaic of animals, right? Animals, birds that depicts actually the abundance and the wealth of that period. And we are talking about actually fauna and flora from Egypt, right? And during the Byzantine period, when even the Roman period, when we talk about the fauna and flora from Egypt, we are talking about the most important place in the world, like right? It's a very important civilization, and when you take elements from the civilization and show its wealth and abundance, right? Because it's a church where the multiplication happened, we're talking about the beauty of it, right? So we have this area, we have the fauna flora from from Egypt, right? And underneath it here we have a small window that shows remains from the 4th century, the 5th and the 4th century. But in the center of the church, underneath the altar, you can see the 4 legs here. We have the rock that is venerated upon which, according to tradition, the miracle happened, right? And just beside this rock, we have a very extremely famous mosaic that I would see on many postcards that depicts the two fish, and 4 loaves of bread. Why only 4 are depicted? Those who know can reply in the chat, see if you know the right answer. So we have 2 fish and 4 loaves, although in the gospel we are talking about 5 loaves of bread. And to the left-hand side, right, opposite to this mosaic, you have another very interesting mosaic that also relates to Egypt, which is the Nylometer, right? Again, we are measuring the wealth and abundance, and again relating to the multitude of the rainwater collected during a certain year. And you'll find the Nylometer in several other areas. One of those areas is also Sepphoris, which is not far away from Tiberias, and it's a very important element as well to have here. And around it again, you have the same fauna and flora that we found on the other side, with the birds and plants. So we move to our next place, the Primacy of Peter, where the 3rd apparition of Jesus took place, and called the Primacy of Peter because also in this passage we have Jesus being reinstated as the chief among the apostles in the passage that we're not going to read, but we're going to read the apparition itself. We can see the beautiful church, the basalt church that belongs to the Franciscans, under the custody of the Franciscans of the Holy Land, right? And you have the shore of Tiberias. What is also unique about this location is that in many places that we'll go to visit around Tiberias, right, you will see the sea very close by, but you will not have direct access to it. You could have in Capernaum, not in not all the places are open, but you can get close to it in Capernaum. But here you can actually take off your shoes and go into the sea, of course, without swimming, because it's not a place of recreation. But you can go inside, at least like be in the waters, which is a very interesting experience. And many pilgrims that go there will take off their shoes and have this very interesting experience. We'll see pictures later on to see how Tiberias throughout the years will fluctuate in the amount of water. And sometimes it will actually almost reach the basis of the church itself. So during the passage that we'll read in a moment, we'll have Jesus talking to the disciples from the shore. And according to tradition, Jesus will be standing on these rocks that will continue into the church itself. And we'll be talking to the disciples from the rocks here. And of course, we'll have breakfast. Also, he will invite them to breakfast from these rocks as well, which is a very interesting and human actually experience that that Jesus and the disciples had during this third apparition, which is also a very interesting contrast between the apparition and this human experience of breakfast. So let's move on to the following slide. We have, of course, the Primacy of Peter. I'm reading from John 21, 1 through 14. So Jesus and the miraculous catch of fish. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the son of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out to go into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to hold the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So again, we have the pictures that we had in the first slide, and we can see the stone and the continuation of the stone inside the church. So when you go into the sanctuary, it's a beautiful, it's a huge garden, first of all. So when you leave from the bus and enter to the sanctuary, you'll go through a beautiful road that leads to the church, and on both sides you have the garden. And when you're going down on the left-hand side, you have the monastery of the Franciscans that you can see here, where my mouse is pointing with the satellite dishes. And you can have a very interesting experience of reflection and meditation on those 2 events of the miracle itself, and also on the events of the Primacy of Peter that we mentioned before. So you can enter the church and have a time here, or actually can sit on the shore and have this connection time, and take advantage of it, because that's one of the only places there you can see the shore and have this kind of calm experience in connection with those 2 elements, and have a kind of a touch point with the sea itself. So when we mentioned a little bit the primacy of Peter and the fact that Jesus will ask him later on, do you love me, right? 3 times. he will ask them in a very different, two different forms, right? We're talking about Jesus talking in the agapao form in Greek, which means actually the supernatural love that Jesus is talking about, and Peter is answering him, yes, I love you, with a very different kind of level of love, which is a phileo, right? Which is a much more humane and lower down version, much more lower down version of the agapao. And that's why Jesus asked him several times, right? Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And again, here, like we mentioned last week, we have a back and forth between Jesus and Peter, right? Peter is revealing who is Jesus to the disciples, and then again, there he will mention again that Jesus will mention who Peter is among the disciples, right? The head actually of the group. And again, here there's the reinstatement of Peter as chief among the apostles. And here we're talking about the passage from John 21:15 through 25. And this statue, we will find it also just in front of the shore in the same sanctuary of the primacy of Peter. Since we're talking about the shore, we have the different levels, right? It's fluctuating every couple of years in the Sea of Tiberias, and this is very interesting, right? In one spot, you can see how low the Sea of Tiberias is, because every single year during summertime, it's one of the highlight discussions, right, in the Holy Land about where the Sea of Galilee is at. And here you can see how low it is in comparison to last year, how full the Sea of Galilee was, and it's quite impressive when the Sea of Galilee is rising very, very high. Usually beginning of June, so very, very soon, the Franciscans go on a pilgrimage to the Primacy of Peter, and they will have a mass on the shore, right, in the area that we mentioned. We see again the rock and the church, and you have the Franciscans entering in with the gospel to begin the mass, and we can see a very famous person here, right, called James. You can see him all the time in the old city of Jerusalem, just dressed like Jesus. They call him the Jesus guy in Jerusalem. He's a very, very nice guy. You can, when you see him in Jerusalem, can actually go talk to him, and he's a very nice person. He usually is walking like this always, and dressed in white, bare feet, and usually praying in the Holy Sepulchre in the old city of Jerusalem. But sometimes also accompanies the Franciscans to the pilgrimages throughout the year. So this is another angle. So when you enter the sanctuary, you'll go through the garden, right? You'll see the church on your left-hand side, and then you'll get to the shore. And this is the view that you have from the shore. This is an angle with the Franciscans going in procession to start the mass, and you have the local Palestinian Christians waiting for the Custos, the head of the Franciscans in the Holy Land, to start the mass. So it's a beautiful view that you have here, and you can see even a small in the background. There's a small figure here that did the experience that I just mentioned. They take off her shoes and then go in for a small dip and then come back just before mass, actually, which is a bit tricky. So here again, you can see the same levels of the waters, right? This is in 2019. This is in April 2020. You can see how high the water was, just like even covering part of the rocks that here are not even being touched, which is very interesting as well. This is actually this picture on the right hand side I took with a drone. So I wasn't on the boat back then. So it's a shot from the drone of the Primacy of Peter. So we are at our third site, which is a huge location around the Sea of Galilee that usually takes the most time to visit. Here we have an angle from west to the east of Capernaum. We can see the entrance of Capernaum. We'll have much better angles later on. We also have a video that showcases the place much better. But you can see how big the place is. You can see the wall behind. We're going to talk about it in much more details in a second. So it's the hometown of Jesus after Nazareth. So when he leaves Nazareth, he will have his HQ, his headquarters in Capernaum. So what happened in Capernaum? I have so many things in Capernaum that it's interesting to have a kind of a small summary. So if you want to look it up later on, you can take some notes and go back to see the passages in the Gospels. But most importantly is, of course, the home of Matthew, the tax collector. It's the center of Jesus's public ministry after he leaves Nazareth. And the miracles, you have many miracles that took place in Capernaum, like the healing of a possessed man during the Sabbath in Luke 4:31 through 36. You have healing of Peter's mother-in-law of fever. So here you can answer all the mother-in-law jokes if you want. Matthew 8:14 through 16. Then healing of the Roman centurion servant in Luke 7:3. Healing of the paralytic lowered from the roof, very famous, Mark 2:1 through 12. And then the raising of the daughter of Jairus from the dead in Luke 8:41 through 53. And of course, this is the very important sermon of the bread of life in John 6:35 through 59. So you see many events that took place in Capernaum, and you can actually spend days talking about this place from a theological and archaeological point of view. We're going to do a small, not that small, but quite a summary of the location from archaeological point of view, right? So let's start with the timeline of Capernaum. Sorry. So the site existed much before actually the Hellenistic period, but I start the Hellenistic period here in the 4th and 3rd century BC, because it's when the site actually started to become very important and start to expand per se. So expansion from a small village near the Via Maris. Via Maris is a road, an ancient trading route that linked Egypt to Mesopotamia and Syria. So the empires together, and it went through the Holy Land, and it passed by Capernaum, which is extremely important, and it also passed by Tabga that we mentioned before. So it's also a very important location as well. So during the Roman period in the 1st century AD, the site grew larger, and we're talking about the time of Jesus, and that's why the first synagogue will be built. I'm going to talk more deeply about the two synagogues. So when we saw the first picture, we saw one of the synagogues. You could maybe spotted one of the synagogue. So I'm going to talk about the two of them and where they're located and how they stack up. In the 4th and 5th century period, Byzantine period again, we have the second synagogue is being built. That's the one that we see today. And the Octagon church is being built over Peter's house, right? We are talking about two important terms here, concepts, the Dominus Ecclesiae and the Insula Sacra, that we will talk about much more in detail in a second. Later on, we have the Persian invasion and the Arab invasion later on of Capernaum and of the whole area, but also Capernaum, and the town will be partially destroyed. And the modern area, we have the land is being purchased by the Franciscans. You have excavations that are being conducted, and then the building of the new church by a different architect that we mentioned last year. Remember, I talked about Antonio Barluzzi that built most of the sites, most of the churches, sorry, about the important sites of the Holy Land. This is not the case of this church. This one was built by a certain Avetta in the beginning of the 20th century. So here we have the video of Capernaum, so we can have a better understanding of the site from an aerial point of view, okay? So we have a footage of the boat, so you can imagine how the disciples were on the boat back then when they were fishing. And here we start the video of Capernaum, right? So I'm going to stop the video throughout to talk a little bit about it. So when we enter the site, it's through this area, and then you start exploring slowly, whether you start with the church or the synagogue itself, and then continue the route up until some guides take them to the shore or not, because they don't have direct access. From this point of view, you can see the site of Capernaum, the Franciscan Capernaum with the wall here, but you have to imagine that the site was much bigger, right? We're talking about close to 2,000 people living here. So it extended to the other side. This is the Greek Orthodox Capernaum with the Church of the 12 Apostles. This is where the house of Peter was. You can see remains on the other side also of Capernaum that were not excavated. The town, parts of the town, the monastery of the Franciscans, the White Synagogue, and below it, below the White Synagogue, you have the 1st century synagogue. So this is the Byzantine period synagogue. And this is the route that leads to Capernaum itself, to the site where the bus parks. And then you enter and visit the site itself. So it's a very interesting angle that you can see, because usually when you are in on pilgrimage, you can't see what you see here today from the drone, because the angle is much more different, of course. And you can see the site is fairly large and only partially excavated. So the Octagonal Church, those are two pictures from the Terra Santa Museum that was built recently in the old city of Jerusalem, the first station of the Way of the Cross. They show two different angles of Capernaum before the construction of the modern church, right? By Avetta that we mentioned, the ultra-modern church. Here we are looking to the east, and the other one is looking to the west. And you can see the Octagon Church and how the town continues below the Byzantine period construction. How the Byzantine period construction builds upon those ruins. And you can see the synagogue before it was reconstructed, right? When we look at it today, we can see the walls. We can see many elements that we did not see in the past. So this is before the reconstruction of the synagogue itself. So here's a zoom on the Octagonal Church. The shape of the octagon is very, very interesting as well, because when we're talking about the octagon is a shape between two shapes, right? Because very often when we go to the sites, we talk about octagon all the time. So why did they choose the form octagon? It's between two very interesting shapes, right? We're talking about the square, which is very human, right? You have the boundaries, you have the angles, right? And you have the circle, which is eternal, right? That you found in many arts. It's actually a guiding feature in many paintings and many constructions, which is referring to much more to an infinite being, an infinite form, etc. And the octagon is in between, right? We're linking the human aspect to the divine aspect. So that's why when you go to many sites in the Holy Land, you will see octagon all over. And this is a very important shape that you have to remember when you visit the churches of the Holy Land. And one of the very famous churches that I don't have a picture here of, maybe it'll be in the future, a different presentation, but we're talking about the Church of Catisma, that is actually near Tantur, a very interesting church that also actually one of the foundation constructions is Catisma, and it's on the way between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and it's where Mary, according to tradition, stopped and to rest before going to Bethlehem to give birth to Jesus, right? So remember, the octagon is a very important shape. They will see it throughout the Holy Land during the Byzantine period. So the findings in Capernaum are also very, very extremely fascinating, right? So when we're talking about the house of Peter, the Insula Sacra that we mentioned in the first slide of Capernaum, so we can see here a reconstruction again given to us by the Terra Santa Museum. You can see how the houses were with the outer square, with the room. So this Insula Sacra could have been Domus Ecclesiae, which is a place of gathering where people would come and pray. We're not 100% sure, but it's a very plausible theory. And if it was the case, it is the first Insula Sacra in the Holy Land. There's another one very close to Tiberias in Megiddo. In Megiddo, that's also a Domus Ecclesiae, but this is the first place where Christians gathered to pray to Jesus, right? And inside this structure, there are proofs that this place was an Insula Sacra, and most probably also a house of worship, which are the 157 graffitis that were found inside, with 127 in Greek, 18 in Aramean, 15 in Latin, and all mention the name of Jesus, Peter, or Rome. So it's quite specific. And inside the Insula Sacra and this house, we found nets, right? Weights for nets and fishing lines in Peter's house, and also dating from the first century. So the findings are very interesting. And plus, on top of that, in the Insula Sacra, so we know that this place was completely different from the other places, because the flooring, right? The flooring was completely different. It was taken care of. It was redone several times. And you can see that with all the findings in the Insula Sacra, plus the fact that they found oil lamps and the flooring was completely different, prove that this place was indeed the house of Peter. So the synagogue, right? We talked about the synagogue. We saw it in the footage in the video. And this is a close-up of the synagogue itself. We're talking about the Byzantine period synagogue, right? The White Synagogue. In the Franciscan archives, we see that it was not reconstructed. Here we can see already the walls. We see some of the columns and the capitals already standing. So it is quite impressive. And there's what is also impressive is the contrast between the limestone of the synagogue and the basalt stone that we see all over Tiberias. Stark contrast. They are not 100% sure where this limestone came from, but it was not brought from the area of Tiberias for sure, but because there are no limestones in this area. So you can see when you enter the synagogue, you would enter from the main gate. When you look at it, you can see clearly a basilical structure. Right, the basilical structure is extremely famous both in the Christian tradition and the Hebrew tradition, as we can see here. And the basilical construction is very important. Right, here we can see also the benches all around that says it's a synagogue. People would sit and pray. In the Christian tradition, the basilical construction is very peculiar, right? Because in the Roman period, it was a lay construction where people would they would go inside, they would worship, but it was not only made for worship. People would gather, they would have meetings, they would have general gatherings, and so it served everything and nothing at the same time. In the Christian tradition, and later on also in the Jewish tradition, when you would enter, especially in the Christian tradition, the basilical construction, like if we take Notre Dame, for instance, as being reconstructed nowadays, you would have a full sensory experience, right? You would enter, you would have this experience with your auditory experience. You would smell the incense. You would see the windows depicting different stories. You would see the paintings. So throughout the centuries, where people were illiterate, they would have this biblical and basically learning experience, theological experience, just by walking from the main gate to the most important place, which is the altar and the tabernacle, right? And during the Roman period, you had different entries to the basilica, but in the Christian tradition, in the construction, there would be only one entrance to have this experience when you entered, right? And here again, you have one entry. You have also on the side as well. You would have people gathering here for the prayers, and you would have also an annex. This annex, we do not know exactly what it was used for, but it's here, and we have the main hall for the prayer on the left hand side. It was most probably also two-level construction, as we can see in the following reconstruction. It's hypothetical, but it's still interesting to see. With the entrance that we saw, another entrance that we have here on the left hand side, and the second level with the roof as well, and the annex on the right hand side. So you have, again, when you enter Capernaum, you have different elements that were not put back in the synagogue because people need to see them, right? So you can see them when you enter or when you leave the synagogue. It's much more interesting to see them when you leave, because you have a much more complete view of what the synagogue was. Because underneath the synagogue that we saw, there's also a first century synagogue that you cannot see much of, right? You can see a small layer, right? Let me go back a little bit. You can see small layers of the first century synagogue, but we do not see how it was constructed. But according to the Franciscan archaeologists, they say that there was also a first century synagogue, probably the one where Jesus actually prayed, and is also mentioned in the Gospels. So the findings here are also very interesting, because you can see them from close by, and you have different elements. The first element is also another question that I would like to see maybe answers in the chat, because it's very interesting and it has very complex elements. So So this here, what can we see? We can see two wheels, right? On those wheels, we have the columns, right? And the construction, right? Here you can see the bases, the capitals, the column itself. You can see a main door, very interesting as well. And above the door, you can see, how do you call that? A shell, right? A seashell that is very famous in the throughout history in the paintings. A very famous painting with a shell is one of Venus, right? The birth of Venus. Very interesting. So when you see those elements combined, what does that remind us of, right, from the Old Testament? It's a very interesting depiction. It could be that. It's one of the interpretations that the archaeologists have put forward. I'm not going to give the answer right now, but if you combine all those elements, the columns, the wheels, the door, the seashell, right, what's result do we have? So we have kind of a construction that is moving. That's all the hints I can give. Let's see what you can come up with in the chat. So in the following picture, we have a capital, right? Capital with the menorah that we saw in a depiction of in Magdala, right? The Corinthian order here with the acanthus leaves and with the menorah. Very interesting. So we have a twist in the architecture here, the Roman plus Jewish. And here more details with another tiny column, two tiny columns with capitals, again seashell, right? And here a star, which is not the Star of David. It will become Star of David much later on, to be coined as the Star of David much later on during most probably the Middle Ages. But before that period, this star was a simple geometrical shape that could signify something related to purity, right? To purity and knowledge. And you can find that in many structures, both in the Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, and pagan traditions as well. So these are the elements that you can see when entering or leaving the synagogue. So when you enter the church, the ultra-modern church built in the beginning of the 20th century, you will that's the shape that we'll see again, octagon, to replicate the shape that is below this church. And in the middle of this octagon, you have a window that shows directly to the room of Peter, right? It's very hard to take pictures from this area because you have all the reflections, but you would see the room. It's quite empty. The flooring is a bit different. You can see two stones with graffitis on them, not clearly, but still. And yeah, it's a ultra modern church, and it's interesting that it can give you this look into the house of Peter from above. Our last stop today, that was also mentioned last week, is the Church of the Beatitudes, and one of the most beautiful lookouts on the Sea of Galilee, and a beautiful church because, I mean, it was built by the very famous Antonio Barluzzi. By now you know that I'm a big fan of Antonio. I call him by his first name as if we had class together. So here we have the Sermon on the Mount, and that you can see from Matthew 5:7. This is the facade of the church. Again, we see how Antonio Barluzzi takes the stone that is around the area, right, and uses the basalt stone to build, and same time build something new, but use the stone that is in the area to build something new, right? New that, but at the same time that helps us remember what was in the past, right? A very famous discourse. And what is interesting, although there's the basalt stone, you have also something very interesting, right? You have this passageway here that you can see in many European constructions, right? You have this gallery here that is, if you go, for instance, in France, you can see many palaces that have those galleries that give this impression of transparency, but still it's a very solid construction, right? Transparency with the basalt stone that is extremely black. So you have contrasts with the elements that are being used and the architecture to both incorporate what's outside and keep the elements in the inside. So both elements on many different levels. Again, just to recall a few elements of of Antonio Barluzzi's genius. So when you enter the church, you can see that it's concentric construction. It's an octagon. Again, you have the 8 Beatitudes mentioned on the floor and the ceiling, and you have in the center, you have the altar, right? And when you go to the church, when you enter the sanctuary, you will see the 8 Beatitudes. This is one of them. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. And each couple of meters, you will see another Beatitude. And this is an aerial view of the Church of the Beatitudes with the Sea of Galilee behind it. And again, remember last week we talked about the very famous picture that many people will take when they go to the Beatitudes of those trees. I remember you asked me what was the type of tree. So I have the answer. This one is right. It was, like you mentioned, the blue jacaranda, I guess. That's how they pronounce it. And just in case, because I know that the question will come, the second flower, it's a bougainvillea. Okay? So you have the 2 flowers here, and it's a beautiful view. And that's from the garden of the Church of the Beatitudes. They have a beautiful garden. You can go there again. They have a guest house where you can stay for the night or for a couple of days. And you have the church and the garden for itself for meditation. It's an amazing experience. And of course, with this view, there's even no need for me to sell this experience, right? And that's it. Thank you. And here you have a view of Tiberias. This is looking towards the south.
Thank you very, very much, Nizar. And lots of great questions coming in.
All right.
I'm just going to ask 2 because we just want to also do the reflection. And what we can then do is maybe those people that want to stay afterwards, we can maybe answer the other questions after the full session. Sure. So the first one, do the mosaics at Tabach imply that the creators were Egyptians? And what were the Egyptians doing in the Holy Land there?
No. I mean, the Egyptians were not in this area. I mean, the Egyptians did arrive in the Holy Land a bit. I mean, before the Byzantine period, and they left traces in many areas, like in Bet Shean, for instance, or in Jaffa, or even in the south by Eilat in Timna. But here it was only an artistic form that was spread all around. So if you go, for instance, to Sephoris, you will have a gallery, right? A gallery of mosaics, and you will have many shapes and forms of mosaics that we think that people would go there and choose the type of mosaic that they would like paved for them, right? So you will find Amazons, you will find Egyptian style, you will find many types of mosaics that were very famous in that period. So no, they were not Egyptians, but the inspiration is Egyptian.
Perfect, thank you. Why are there so many names for the Sea of Galilee, and what would cause the rise of the Sea of Galilee to rise so dramatically?
Those are 2 very good questions. I mean, the first question, why are there so many names? It's depending on which period you're talking. Each civilization that will come and will be in the land, it will give a different name for an area, right? When we're talking about the Sea of Galilee, it's fairly obvious. We're talking about Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, right? Although it's much more of a lake, right? So when we're talking about Genezareth, we're talking about Ginosar. There's a very famous kibbutz now called Ginosar, still there. That was the reference back then. So it depends which area time we're in throughout history, you will have a different name. Like if there are also other names that it not mentions, like the Sea of Kenya, right? That was during the Muslim period, right? You see many names. I did not do the whole list, only the famous names, and the names are most common that you will find in scientific literature or in the Bible.
Thank you. And I know I said I just want one more question. Is Israel or is the Holy Land open to pilgrims right now?
For the moment, yes, they are open for small groups. You need to be vaccinated. It's really a bit of an awkward situation where it's open, but it really depends on how the situation is going elsewhere, right? So you need to be, everyone needs to be vaccinated. You need to go through the PCR, tests, so it's yes and no. We're not there yet, let's say.
Great. So we'll store the other questions till after the reflection with Father John Paul and Stephanie. Okay. Thank you, Nizar.
Sure.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Not only was it wonderful, Nizar, I kind of felt like I was trying to drink from a fire hydrant. There was a lot of stuff in there. this really good historical data, but then also what you also did, which is a wonderful segue into some of my reflections, is you presented so many of the accounts of healings and other miracles that Jesus did in the Holy Land. So I want to start out by just simply saying, in the resurrection experience, we keep coming back to this icon. Christ is risen from the dead, and by his death, he has trampled upon death, granting life to those in the tombs. And it's that lifting up of Adam and Eve, the lifting up of others that they might have life, that I think it really is at the heart of Jesus' initiative of sending word to the disciples, go back to Galilee, where there you will see me. It's returning to the lake. It's returning not just to a comfort zone, but it's returning to a place where there were so many things that happened. Above all, I think it was a desire on Jesus' part to invite them to remember the experiences that they had of him there in that lake area, and to be reintegrated into those experiences. And so it was the invitation, re-immerse yourself into those significant experiences, gnaw on them, because there's something there to learn, something is happening. And one of the things that Nizar mentioned was that it was along the lake that Jesus gave the sermon about the bread of life. I am the bread of life. He also had mentioned too, unless you really eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink of his blood, you will not have life within you. Well, the word that he used for eating was really to sink your teeth into something, not just eat, but to sink your teeth into something, to chew on it, to gnaw on it. And the same thing with unless you drink of the blood of the Son of Man. What he was really talking about was unless you really drink deeply, that you have this profound thirst where you're almost guzzling. And so therefore, the return to Galilee, I think, is an invitation of Jesus to really say, again, I'm the bread of life. You need to sink your teeth into this. You need to gnaw on it a lot more. But it's also an experience of being lifted up in what that experience was in Galilee. And so the lake experience is, as Nizar mentioned, it reflects the call of the disciples, the multiplication of the loaves. It also reflects, that this lake, even though it's 8 miles by 13 miles, with the maximum depth of around 140 feet, it can also churn up huge waves. And so there's the stormy sea images that were there. And we also know that Peter was invited to, in the midst of a stormy sea, to walk on the stormy sea. And we know he got out of the boat, and as long as his focus was on Jesus, he was doing well. But as soon as the focus, was turned away from Jesus, he sank. And Jesus' hand was there reaching down to lift him up out of the water, to lift him up out of sinking into the depths. And so it's a powerful image. It's again, Jesus reaching out to Adam and Eve, to reaching out to all of us. We also know there was the feeding of the 5,000 loaves, where this little kid brings forward, the 5 little barley loaves and the 2 fish. And yet this little kid with such a small amount of food makes it available to Jesus, who really does something wonderful with it. And it's also the place where there was the miraculous catch of fish, not just in John 21, but also the miraculous catch of fish where Peter is stunned by this, having fished all night and never caught anything, and now catching all of this, and says to Jesus, "Leave me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." But in the midst of all of this too, Scripture is talking about crossing to the other side. And I think that's what Jesus is inviting us to do, to cross to the other side by really gnawing and re-immersing ourselves into these reflections. You know, one of the things that goes through my mind also with the disciples being invited to return to Galilee, where they would experience him as risen in the midst of all of these memories. Kellogg's cornflakes a number of years ago had an ad that says, "Taste them again for the first time." And I can't help but think that's what Jesus is doing here, is just saying, live these experiences again for the first time. And so what did you experience for the first time? What are you experiencing now as you remember all of these things in light of the resurrection? And so it's that invitation, go back and see things now again through the eyes of the passion, the death, and resurrection. Jesus is also continuing to invite us to cross to the other side. The other side is a new way of understanding, a new way of learning, a new way of listening, a new way of hearing him saying, "Come follow me." And so crossing to the other side is us reorienting our lives according to this Jesus who offers us life, who lifts us up. And crossing to the other side also means discerning spirits that lead us to a greater life. And so being invited to go back to Galilee, the disciples were to experience again what happened there, in order to experience them at a much deeper level. Ignatius in the spiritual exercises is always asking us to repeat meditations. Why? Because in repeating something, in reviewing it over, something shows really of greater clarity. We have a greater vision, a greater meaning, a greater purpose, a greater direction. And so with Jesus being inviting the disciples and us to return to Galilee, experience all of this again for the first time, but not the last time. And so now Stephanie Saldana will share some further reflections.
We return. We go back to Galilee. Today, I want to talk about casting our nets. Recently, I was talking to my spiritual director. I had written a proposal for a book and kept sending it out and getting disappointing news. And at the same moment that happened, other friends who were writers were getting their books published and winning prizes. And every time I heard that news, I tried my best to be excited. And then when I returned home, I started to feel the little pangs. So I told my spiritual director, I said, I don't want to just pretend like I'm happy when I hear my friend's good news. I actually want to be happy. And she laughed and she said, "Oh, we can't do that on our own. It's impossible." She said, "That's only possible with God. That's a grace." And suddenly I felt a huge release. And I said, well, I know what I'm praying for tonight. That same day, I was reading Martin Luther King, who talked about loving our enemies. And he said, that's not possible. It's only possible with God. Nope, we can't do that on our own. Indeed, when we read the Gospels, we keep coming up against things that are impossible. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hurt you. Bless those who curse you. Turn the other cheek. So we arrive at the lakeside scene that Nazar already talked about, so I'll just read a little bit about it. When Simon Peter says to them, I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. So we can move ahead to the next slide. That night they caught nothing, it says. How often have we felt that way in our own lives? We try to do our best, but we find ourselves unable to love, unwilling to forgive, unable to imagine our way out of a situation we're stuck in. Our net keeps coming up empty. Then the disciples hear the voice of the risen Christ. "Cast your net again to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." They cast their nets again, but this time they're led by Jesus's voice, and their nets come up full. They meet the abundance the Nizar spoke to us about, the abundance found in Christ Jesus. Listen. So today we're invited to look back into our own lives and to identify those places where we've reached our human limits. Someone has wounded us and we find no way to forgive. Where the net keeps just coming up empty. Might we pray and, following God's voice, cast the net one more time? Someone has disappointed us one too many times. Might we pray and, following God's voice, cast the net again? Or maybe, like me, you live in a political conflict and things are about to come to a boil and you think, "Oh, this has been going on forever. Here we go again. Nothing's going to change." Might we cast the net again so that we might become prophetic witnesses of hope? What if there's something you desire? To learn a new language, or to make new friends, or to finally go on retreat. But obstacles just keep coming up. And so you tell yourself, "It's not possible, it's too hard," or "I'm too old." Might we pray and, with God's help, maybe cast the net again? A child we want to feel closer to, a prayer life we want to deepen. Might we ask God to help us be in tune and to cast the net again? What happens when we stop trying to navigate our lives with our own efforts and allow ourselves to be led by God's voice? In the Examine, the Ignatian Prayer that I'm sure many of us do, either in the middle of the day or the end, we look back on our day to see where God shows up, to see where God is moving through our lives. As Dennis Ham, SJ, memorably called it, it's rummaging for God. We prayerfully review the events of the day, moment by moment, allowing our gaze to slow at anything that feels important. When I first tried it, it didn't work. It's like, why is everybody so excited about this prayer? I looked back on my day and all I saw was coffee and laundry and staring at a blank computer screen. I was like, well, that's depressing. I soon gave up. Later, as I read about it more, I understand what I did wrong. The Examine doesn't say, look back through your day. It says, look back on your day with God's eyes. Or in some versions, in the presence of God, or allow God to guide your gaze. When I looked back on the day with my eyes, the net kept coming up empty. But when I prayed for the grace to see my day as God sees it, the net came up full. Roses, my daughter's laughter, a door held open, a hand held beside the bed, a bird landing on a tree, God over and over and over again, a net full of fish. So today we ask to become aware of those places in our lives where we experience resistance, and in prayer, recognize God inviting us to cast the net again, this time with God. To trust that God will make possible what we cannot accomplish on our own. To, like Peter, be so excited that we jump in the water when we live the joy of the resurrection, seeing to our delight our nets coming up full.
So casting the net again. Taste all this again for the first time. And I can't help but making one comment about the icon right previous to this. If we could take a step back, I couldn't help but notice a little Weber grill down in the lower right-hand corner, Jesus cooking on. So. Thank you, Nizar. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all for your presence here. We're entering next week with the final in our series. And so thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah. Thank you, Father John Paul and Stephanie and Nizar, from our side as well. So as Father John Paul said, please join us next week when we're back in Jerusalem with Hannah, where she will be leading us through Jerusalem and dealing with all the ascension of Jesus and the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles. And if those that are wanting to still be interested in some of the questions, please feel free to stay on the line, because Nizar has agreed to answer them for us. But for the others, I'm wishing you a blessed and good week. And if I may ask for just prayers for tomorrow, when we also have the Jerusalem Day in the Holy Land. As we've seen, there's quite a bit of tension. So if we could just all unite across the globe for the wonderful and beautiful Holy Land, that would be very good. Thank you, everyone. God bless. Bye-bye. Okay, so Nizar, while people are dropping off, but the others are staying, one question that was beautiful with Father John Paul. Does the fact that Jesus cooked breakfast imply that from a first century standard, that he was actually doing a woman's work? Any thoughts?
That's a very detailed question. It's a very good question. It's very detailed. So from my opinion, I don't think that it was a woman's work, because when men used to go work for hours and hours, like you can see the fishermen in the Gospels are going for a whole night. I mean, I don't think they waited, till they got home for their wives to cook for them. So they would cook outside. So logically, I think it wasn't necessarily women's work. So both did them, depending on how the circumstances were and if they were hungry or not.
Okay, thank you. How long did people generally spend in synagogues, and would they eat together after a service, as they seem to always be on the move as well?
I mean, nowadays when we're talking about a form in the synagogue where you follow a very strict rules of prayers of service. I mean, the hour. I mean, there's a specific timing where you can go, and then you finish, right? You enter, you have the prayers, and then you leave. It's just like in church, right? Back in the first and second century, before the destruction of the temple, you had the synagogue had a different meaning, right? People would gather as well, would meet with each other, and some people would pray and others won't. So it was the literal meaning of synagogue, which is a place where you gather, right? So it's only after the second temple period where there was a lack of head, let's say, because there was no more. The second temple was already destroyed. They had to build a very strict rule of readings like we have in the church today. So I think nowadays I'm not sure how long the service lasts, but back then it was it varied, I would imagine.
And varied meaning a couple of hours, and
it could be most probably much less. I would say top an hour, but it's only a personal opinion. I would have to look much more into that.
okay, great. Is there a significance of why in June do the Franciscans make the pilgrimage to the Primacy of Peter's church? And also then, who's that mass open to?
That mass is open to everyone. If you can get there, it's open to everyone. You can see that the area is pretty big. They have plastic chairs, and then everybody can sit and attend mass. And in June, I would guess for the important pilgrimages or important feasts like Easter, Christmas, etc., you have a fixed date, because I mean it's a very solid tradition, and you'd follow like December and Easter whenever that falls. But for the more minor feasts, I think they placed them whenever they could, right? I think I'm not exactly sure why in June. That I would have to check, but I don't think there's a real significance to the month for the minor feasts. I mean,
Nisa, this person was saying that most people don't know that there's been an indigenous Christian presence in Palestine since Jesus' day. Can you tell us something about this long-time native Christian presence?
That's a very long topic. I mean, yes, I mean, since when we were talking since Jesus' period, of course, we're talking about Jews that followed Christ, that would later on become Christians. But you have many denominations, especially in the Mosaic of Jerusalem. You have many Christian denominations, among which you have the Greek Catholics, which are the largest community. They represent 60% of the population. Greek Catholics belong to the Catholic Church. They follow Rome. You have the Greek Orthodox that are 30% of the Christian population. I mean, the Greek Catholics are mainly in Galilee. You have some small community in Jerusalem and the West Bank, but most of them are in Galilee. Greek Orthodox, I mentioned, 30%, and you have the smaller communities like the Latins, the Copts, the Syriacs, the Ethiopians, of course the Maronites. So many small communities, and the two big ones are the Greek Catholics and the Greek Orthodox, representing 60 and 30%. And then the rest of the statistics are divided between the other denominations.
And they still like 1% of the Holy Land Christians are today about 1% of?
They're 2%.
2%.
2%. Among the Arab population, which is 20%. So we are a double minority, if you can call it like that.
Okay. And two more questions. Sorry, they just keep coming in.
Sure.
Does James belong to? You showed the picture of James there at St. Peter's. Does James belong to the Franciscans, or is he just an independent person?
Independent person. I'm not sure where he came from. He told me once when we met. His name is James. He came here and he followed the literal word of the Gospels: leave everything and follow Christ. So he left all his possessions, and I was working bare feet, and he dresses in white and lives off of donations. And he's a very sweet person. And whenever you meet him, he's ready to talk to you. He's just a very nice person. If you meet him, don't hesitate to go and say hello.
And then the last question, I promise, Nizar.
No problem.
What is the situation in Jerusalem, as we are seeing a heart-rending situation in the media currently?
Yeah, currently the situation in Jerusalem is very tense. I mean, every year you have some ups and downs. This is the toughest down that we've had in a couple of years. I mean, you've probably heard about the Intifadas, the first and the second, and now we're having a very tense situation, especially in two main areas: Damascus Gate and the Sheikh Jarrah, a neighboring area to Damascus Gate. And they're the main problems are basically settlers that are present in many parts of Jerusalem and the West Bank. And the tensions is around evictions, and some people even call it ethnic cleansing. And so it's quite complicated, and it's a very very low down, and we need to pray for this. It's especially these couple of days. As you mentioned, tomorrow is Jerusalem Day, and many of the extreme Jews youngsters will be in Jerusalem, will be parading, and they will go through Damascus Gate, and probably will later on be heading to the sensitive areas, among which the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa, and Sheikh Jarrah. Let's hope that tomorrow will resolve in a not so dramatic situation.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Nizar.
Yes, of course.
So that is the last question. And you also saw that there was a lot of nodding when we mentioned it just now. So be reassured that the beautiful people in the Holy Land of this community's prayers for you all today and also tomorrow and the days to come.
Thank you.
So, God bless everyone. Thank you for staying. And I hope that answered everyone's questions. And see you all next week. Take care. God bless. Bye. Bye-bye. Agnes. Lovely to